From his first day in office, President Donald Trump began signing executive orders based on promises he made on the campaign trail. Those executive orders were numerous and far-reaching, covering everything from energy to immigration. But how do these orders play into one of his campaign cornerstones, improving the economy for all Americans? We go on the record.
From WPBF 25, this is On the Record with Nathalie Pozo.
Good morning and thank you so much for joining us. It has been just about 2 weeks since President Donald Trump took office, and he is wasting no time in making the changes he spoke about while he was running for president. Joining me now to discuss these many executive orders and also what this means for the U.S. economy is Brian Cutsinger, an assistant professor at the College of Business at FAU. Thank you so much for being here with us this morning, Professor.
Thank you so much for having me.
So we have a lot to get to, so let's jump right in. You know, he made a lot of these promises on the campaign trail. We saw him sign these orders his first day, even before he got to the White House. Some of them, what he was talking about on the campaign trail, others undoing what the previous administration has done. Can you kind of just give us an overview of what we're seeing here?
Sure. So the ones dealing specifically with the economy instruct the various government agencies to find ways to bring down costs for consumers. Obviously, one of the things that the president ran on was trying to get inflation under control, which had been an issue over the last few years. In addition, of course, the president has issued executive orders dealing with immigration. Of course, immigration has more than just to do with the economy, but of course it has economic implications. So in terms of the economy, those are the big ones, looking at finding ways to bring down costs for Americans, and then also looking at immigration.
And, you know, we saw him sign some of these executive actions right there in the arena before he even made his way into the White House. Some of them, though, have been blocked already, 2 of them coming to mind. What do you think moving forward? Are we going to see maybe, you know, judges blocking some of these going forward?
Well, I think that would be, I don't know that I have any special insight on that as an economist, but it certainly seems like some of these that are a bit more controversial could get tied up in the courts for a little while, and some of them might eventually end up making their way all the way to the Supreme Court. So the birthright citizenship executive order is one example here, and I think the one that maybe came out yesterday, earlier this week, I should say, dealing with the Office of Office of Personnel Management. That's going to be another one that might get tied up in the courts for a little while. So I don't know if that one would go all the way to the Supreme Court, but certainly it seems like the birthright citizenship one might.
I mean, we're talking about Amendment 14
sure,
there on that
yeah,
one.
Exactly, exactly.
So what exactly are we seeing here with President Trump signing all of these executive orders? Is this something we have seen with presidents in the past, that they just come in and, you know, they sign dozens and dozens of them?
Yeah, this is pretty common. You may like it, you might not like it, but it is a fairly common practice for different administrations to direct the executive branch to act in a way that's consistent with what the president ran on. The executive branch is obviously quite large. It's involved in a lot of policy, and the president is responsible for managing that policy. So it's not altogether surprising then that when there's a change of an administration, that the president is going to direct the executive branch to act in a way that's consistent with the policies that the president ran on.
You know, when we look at the campaign and, you know, the last 4 years and the previous term, I think a lot of people voted this time with their wallets. That's what they were looking at. There's a lot of controversy, you know, surrounding many of the things that the president would speak on his campaign trail. But 77 million people said, I'm thinking about, you know, my money, you know, what this means for my life. How quickly do you think that we will be able to see some of these promises that the president has made?
So the price thing is difficult, right? Because in some sense, if you look at what the Federal Reserve is projecting for inflation, the Federal Reserve is not projecting deflation, which is what you would need to have to get the overall level of prices to come back down. In other words, the Fed is saying, look, we're trying to get our inflation target back down to 2%, which means that the overall level of prices is going to be rising by about 2% every year. So in terms of the overall level of prices, I'm not sure we're going to see the price level, as economists call it, come back down to where it was before the pandemic. Now, the president can pursue certain policies that reduce business costs and therefore make it cheaper to produce the goods and services that regular folks buy. And so in that sense, we might see the prices of certain goods and services come down as a result of some of these executive orders, but the overall level of prices is likely to remain elevated.
And Professor Cutsinger, we want to get much more into the economy right after this break, but we do have to go take a commercial break. But lots to talk about here this morning. Coming up, we're going to take a look at the executive orders focused on energy, DEI, and President Trump's American First trade policy. We will be covering several of Donald Trump's executive orders this morning. You can read them for yourself in their entirety online. They're available at the address that you see right there on your screen. That's the official White House website. We'll be right back.
You're watching On the Record on WPBF 25.
Welcome back. I'm joined by Professor Cutsinger from FAU's College of Business as we continue our conversation this morning on the executive orders signed by President Donald Trump. Professor, right before the break, we were talking about inflation. I want to talk a little bit about interest rates because we have heard the president say that he wants to demand that the feds lower the interest rate, something though that the banks say really can't be done. You were touching upon that inflation has to get to 2% before anything like that can really be done.
Yes, so the Federal Reserve is in charge for managing what's called the federal funds rate, which is a rate that banks use to loan money to one another basically overnight. And the Fed raises or lowers that rate to pursue whatever their monetary policy objectives happen to be, which generally is about 2% inflation every year. Now, right now, inflation is running a little bit above that, which means it's unlikely that the Fed would be cutting rates any further. Part of the reason for that, I think, is that the federal government is obviously running very large budget deficits, and that is, of course, pushing interest rates higher. And so the problem here is that the Fed is in a tough spot because simply cutting rates doesn't make things better, right? The fact of the matter is that the federal government is borrowing a lot from capital markets, and that's pushing interest rates higher. If the Fed doesn't respond to that, in other words, if the Fed were to cut rates instead of trying to keep its policy rate in line with what's going on with capital markets, it could actually reignite inflation. So that's sort of my view on that.
Do you think that we'll ever see those interest rates we saw after the pandemic?
Probably not. If we do, actually, it probably would not be a great thing because in part those interest rates were so low because of the lack of economic activity. So I think it's probably unlikely that we see interest rates that low again. But if you look at the bond markets, for example, the bond markets are projecting about 2.3-ish% inflation over the next 5 years, which means that a lot of what's going on with interest rates is not so much about capital markets expectations of inflation, but rather higher, what economists call real interest rates. And these are being driven in part by the federal government's budget deficits.
All right, Brian, I want to talk a little bit about energy. So the president has made a connection between economic prosperity, lower prices, and also energy. What is that connection?
So if you think about this, energy goes into producing everything that we consume, right? And not only does it go into producing everything that we consume, we use energy to transport goods all over the country and to transport goods all over the world. And so if we can find ways to make energy cheaper, more plentiful, and abundant, then of course that's going to pass through to lower consumer prices because frankly we're just able to produce more at a lower price.
All right, the America First Trade Policy Memorandum, which has a member of his cabinet looking at the existing trade policies to see if they're unfair. Do you think the policies that we have now are unfair? And will the president's staff come across anything that isn't mutually advantageous?
So I'm not sure that I have anything super interesting to say as an economist about what's fair and what's unfair, but tariffs are tough because there's several objectives that you could pursue with tariffs. One is you could use them as a negotiating tool, as we saw the president use the threat of tariffs on Colombia with respect to his immigration policy earlier this week. Another thing you could use tariffs for is to generate revenue, and in fact the president has said that he would like to use tariffs as a way to supplement tax revenue, perhaps cutting income taxes and other types of taxes as an offset. Now, of course, if you're going to use tariffs as a revenue device, well, you need to set them low enough so that people still want to buy imported goods. Because obviously, if the tariffs are so high that no one buys goods that are produced overseas, then we don't generate any tax revenue, right? Because the tariff is basically like a sales tax on imported goods. So that then brings into conflict the goal of perhaps trying to promote American business. So if we're going to use tariffs to promote American business, we have to set them high enough so that people don't want to continue to purchase goods from overseas. But if we do that, then we're not going to generate much tax revenue from the tariff. So there's sort of a tension there about how these things are going to work. And I'm not sure exactly what is in the president's mind about how he and his administration are thinking about how to use tariffs. I guess my hunch is probably it's largely a negotiating tool, but of course I'm not there, so I don't know.
I want to talk a little bit about the short and long-term effects of tariffs, because I read a story earlier this week that was talking already about coffee going up here in the U.S. because of the tariff that was imposed on Colombia, but that was reversed so quickly. Is it possible to see something like that so fast?
Yeah, so when you think about demand for any product like coffee, it depends on what people think is going to happen to the price of it in the future. So if people think that the price of coffee is going to go up in the future, they increase their demand for it today, and as a result, the price of coffee can go up today, even before we've actually experienced the structural effect of the tariff. So the fact that the president showed a willingness to use tariffs as a negotiating tool to pursue his immigration policy agenda signals to people that he's serious about using this as a policy tool, which means that coffee might in fact be more expensive in the future, and then of course it could become more expensive today.
I want to talk a little bit about going back to the way that people voted with their wallet. A lot of people feel that their paychecks just don't go far enough. You know, again, what we were saying, will they see something fast? You know, I think sometimes we think, oh, maybe because, you know, Trump was elected into office, that we're going to go to the grocery store tomorrow and everything's going to be cheaper.
So probably not, because these things do take time. That said, just like if people expect things to be more expensive in the future, demand for those things increases today. The reverse is also true. If we expect things to be cheaper in the future, demand for those things falls today. So it's not impossible that we might see the prices of grocery store items, for example, falling somewhat. I think the other thing we need to pay attention to is not just what's going on with prices, because as I mentioned, the overall level of prices is not going to come back down. The Federal Reserve is very clear about this. They are targeting a positive inflation rate, which means the overall level of prices won't come back down. So what we want to look at then is what's going on with wages. Are wages going to increase by enough to offset the overall increase in prices that we've experienced over the last 5 years? Now, we do see wages increasing, not as fast as perhaps we would like them to see, right? And it's certainly the prices of the things that we buy every day have risen by more than our wages have gone. So over time, I think that the wages are going to come up. Whether or not they get us back to where we were or not, where we were before, is going to depend on the president's policies. And certainly, many of the policies he's talked about pursuing could have that sort of beneficial effect on wages and push them higher, so that even though the prices at the grocery store might be higher, the dollars in your paycheck are also higher, and those two things offset one another.
All right, Professor Cutsinger, we still have a lot more to get to here on the record, including the economic impact that we could see here in South Florida with the executive actions surrounding immigration. Thank you so much for staying with us. We continue our discussion on the recently signed executive orders by President Donald Trump with Professor Brian Cutsinger. Right before the break, we were just talking about people's paychecks. I wanted to now switch the conversation to DEI. We saw the president put a stop on all federal DEI programs. Do you think that this will be beneficial for the economy moving forward?
So one way you could think about this argument is many of these policies do have compliance costs. Now, if you're an advocate of these policies, you probably think these compliance costs are worth it. If you're opposed to these policies, as obviously the Trump administration is, you probably don't think that these compliance costs are worth it. So if your view is that these compliance costs are largely a waste from an economic standpoint, then certainly getting rid of these policies might have some beneficial effect on the economy. But of course, there's no widespread agreement on this. This is, of course, a very contentious issue. So how we think about the costs and benefits of these policies can vary quite a bit between advocates of these policies and opponents of these policies.
Another contentious issue is immigration. So we know that the president has signed several executive orders surrounding immigration. You know, here in Florida, we have a traditional workforce when it comes to, people coming to this country. We're talking about hospitality and a lot of other fields. What do you think the impact of this loss will have here in our state?
I think time will tell, because we've had in past administrations, so for example, former President Obama, former President Bush, both pursued pretty aggressive deportation policies. It's not immediately obvious that we saw those effects manifest at the aggregate level of the economy. So I think time will tell what the effect is going to be on immigration. But I think one of the challenges with this topic, because of course immigration and wages is a topic that they're tied together. So the standard argument you might hear is you say, look, if we have more people coming to the country, that's going to drive down wages. And it seems, okay, that seems intuitive. You increase the supply of labor and you get a lower wage rate. But the important thing to keep in mind is that when immigrants come to the country, right, they also buy stuff, right? They buy groceries, they buy gas, they buy cars.
And many contributing also to society by working.
Exactly,
yes.
exactly. So that increases the demand for workers too. So the actual effect on wages from immigration in the economics literature is actually unclear. You can make a case that it might fall, you can make a case that it might go up, and you could make a case that it might stay the same when we increase the number of workers in the economy. The reverse also holds true though. So if for some reason we take a lot of workers out of the economy, right, yes, the supply of workers goes down, you would think that that would push wages up. But that's not necessarily true because the reason that because the demand for workers could also fall. So it's not at all clear what the actual effect on wages would be from these immigration policies.
So if some businesses, relied heavily on this workforce and they all of a sudden lost this chunk of, their business, is it possible for them to stay afloat? Do they have any other options?
So there's two ways to think about that question. So one way to think about the question is that they lose part of their labor force, but if in the process of losing that labor force, demand for their products fall, then they don't need as many workers to produce as much output as before. So that's the first part. The second part would be that they switch over to using native-born labor, right? In which case wages might go up for native-born, but then of course that drives the business costs higher, right? And that might make it more difficult for them to remain in business, especially the businesses that are, say, just at the margin, not the more well-established ones, but the smaller ones that are just there at the margin. So certainly could be the case that it makes it more difficult for them to stay in business without as many workers.
I know you said time will tell, on the impact it will have here in the state. Is there a sort of timeline? Are we talking about maybe seeing something within a year, even during this administration? Will it be the next administration?
Well, I think, again, when we think about what's going to, if you expect something to get more expensive or cheaper in the future, that's going to affect demand today. So if we expect, for example, wages to go up in the future, wages go up today, and that might make it more expensive for businesses to remain in business. What I meant more by time will tell, I think there's some ambiguity about the magnitude of the president's approach to immigration. I know he said he's wanted to pursue mass deportations. Whether or not that actually ends up happening, I think, is what remains to be seen. And of course, the magnitude of that effect is what's going to have an effect on the economy in the long run.
Is it possible for one field or one business maybe to see a larger impact than another? For example, maybe agriculture, and farming.
Absolutely. So if you have an industry that's that's particularly labor intensive and is perhaps using immigrant labor more than in other industries, yes, certainly they would be more affected by that than an industry that perhaps is not using as much of that kind of labor.
Do you think that some businesses, maybe started planning for these kinds of things in November? I mean, we've heard Trump talk about mass deportations, on the campaign trail, and then when he won the election in November, it was something that he said he was going to do.
Mm-hmm. Certainly, and in fact, if we just take a step back even to the tariff discussion, the same thing is true here. We see businesses preparing for higher costs of imports. I'm sure that we're also going to see businesses preparing for dealing with fewer workers available in the workforce. There's lots of ways they can deal with this. One of them is they can switch over to automation. They can use more machines and whatnot to do the same jobs that were being done by people before. But certainly it seems reasonable to think that this is at the forefront of most business owners' minds of how to deal with this issue.
Professor Cutsinger, before we wrap up, politics aside, I mean, I think a lot of people are hurting right now. Things are expensive out there. Insurance here in Florida, we have the condo crisis. What can we tell people just about our economy and what we can look forward to?
So I agree. Things are very expensive. People are certainly struggling, especially people at the lower end of the income distribution. My hope is that both policy at the state level and policy at the federal government level pursues supply-side reforms that makes us more productive at producing the goods and services that we all rely on every day. And the more productive we can become, the better off everyone will be, especially those at the lowest end of the income distribution.
All right, Professor Brian Cutsinger from FAU, thank you so much for your time
so much.
Diving into these topics. I know there's so much to talk about. I feel like we could do a 5-hour show on this.
Absolutely.
Thank you so much for your time this morning. We'll be right back after this. Thank you for making us a part of your morning. As always, we encourage you to be part of our discussion each and every Sunday right here at 10 a.m. Until then, you can watch this morning's On the Record and every episode on our website, WPBF.com, and our free WPBF 25 News app. Matter of Fact with Soledad O'Brien is next. We'll see you again next Sunday.